of Britain's post-war crimes. The Bush doctrine of anticipatory self-defense was outlined by a senior American official, reported to be Condoleezza Rice, who explained that the phrase refers to the right of the United States to attack a country that it thinks could attack it first. The formulation is not surprising, given her conclusion that international court jurisdiction has proven inappropriate for the United States, and that the United States is not subject to international law and norms generally. Such views reflect a broad range of elite perceptions, but not those of the general public. A large majority of the American public continue to take the position that states are entitled to use force only if there is strong evidence that the country is in imminent danger of being attacked. Thus, this same large majority rejects the bipartisan consensus on anticipatory self-defense, sometimes mislabeled preemptive war, and agrees with the much maligned South Summit and the UN High-Level Panel. The legitimacy of use of force is not the only issue on which public opinion in the United States diverges sharply from elite political culture. Another case already mentioned is the Kyoto Protocols. And there are many others, matters bearing directly on the state of American democracy, to which we return in Chapter 6. The provisions of the UN Charter were spelled out further at the Nuremberg Tribunal. The accompanying Tokyo judgments were far more severe. Though the principles they enunciated were significant, both tribunals were deeply flawed. They were founded on rejection of the principle of universality. To bring the defeated war criminals to justice, it was necessary to devise definitions of war crime and crime against humanity. How this was done was explained by Telford Taylor, Chief Counsel for War Crimes Prosecution, and a distinguished international lawyer and historian. He said, "Since both sides had played the terrible game of urban destruction, the Allies far more successfully, there was no basis for criminal charges against Germans or Japanese, and in fact, no such charges were brought. Aerial bombardment had been used so extensively and ruthlessly on the Allied side, as well as the Axis side, that neither at Nuremberg nor Tokyo was the issue made a part of the trials. The operative definition of crime is crime that you carried out, but we did not." To underscore the fact, Nazi war criminals were absolved if the defense could show that their U.S. and U.K. counterparts carried out the same crimes. Thus, the tribunal excused Admiral Karl Dönitz from breaches of the international law of submarine warfare, on grounds of testimony from the British Admiralty and U.S. Admiral Nimitz, that the United States and U.K. had carried out the same crimes from the first days of the war. As Taylor explains, to punish the foe, especially the vanquished foe, for conduct in which the enforcing nation has engaged, would be so grossly inequitable as to discredit the laws themselves. That is correct, but the operative definition of crime also discredits the laws themselves. Subsequent tribunals are discredited by the same moral flaw. The Yugoslavia Tribunal is an example already discussed, along with far more serious illustrations of Washington's self-exemption from international law and the fundamental principle of universality. The consistency of practice and doctrine is understandable. Just consider the consequences. If the privileged and powerful were willing to entertain for a moment the principle of universality. If the United States has the right of anticipatory self-defense against terror, or against those it thinks might attack it first, then a fortiori, Cuba, Nicaragua, and a host of others have long been entitled to carry out terrorist acts within the United States, because of its involvement in very serious terrorist attacks against them, often uncontroversial. Surely Iran would also be entitled to do so in the face of serious threats that are openly advertised. Such conclusions are, of course, utterly outrageous and advocated by no one. Outrageous conclusions would also follow about past crimes. An inquiry by several highly regarded British journalists shortly after 9/11 found that Osama bin Laden and the Taliban received threats of possible American military strikes against them 2 months before the terrorist assaults on New York and Washington, which raises the possibility that bin Laden, far from launching the attacks on the World Trade Center in New York and the Pentagon out of the blue, was launching a preemptive strike in response to what he saw as U.S. threats. By U.S. and U.K. standards, that should be legitimate anticipatory self-defense. Again, the idea is unthinkable, of course. Similarly, no one would argue that Japan exercised the legitimate right of anticipatory self-defense when it bombed military bases in the virtual U.S. colonies of Hawaii and the Philippines, even though the Japanese knew that B-17 flying fortresses were coming off the Boeing production lines and could read in the American press that the planes were capable of burning down Tokyo, a city of rice paper and wood houses. A November 1940 plan to bomb Tokyo and other big cities was enthusiastically received by Secretary of State Cordell Hull. FDR was simply delighted at the idea, described graphically by its mastermind, Air Force General Claire Lee Chennault, to burn out the industrial heart of the empire with firebomb attacks on the teeming bamboo ant heaps of Honshu and Kyushu. By July 1941, the Air Corps was ferrying B-17s to the Far East for this purpose, moving half of all the big bombers from the Atlantic sea lanes to this region. If needed, the planes would be used to set the paper cities of Japan on fire, General George C. Marshall explained in a confidential press briefing on November 15th, adding that there won't be any hesitation about bombing civilians. 4 days later, New York Times senior correspondent Arthur Krock, presumably basing himself on Marshall's briefing, reported U.S. plans to bomb Japan from Siberian and Philippine bases, to which the Air Force was rushing incendiary bombs intended for civilian targets. Washington knew from decoded messages that Japan was aware of the dispatch of B-17s. All of this provides far more powerful justification for anticipatory self-defense than anything conjured up by Bush, Blair, and their associates. There is no need to spell out what would plainly be implied if elementary moral principles could be entertained. Domestic and international law are not formal axiom systems. There is scope for interpretation, but their general meaning and implications are clear enough. As international law specialists Howard Friel and Richard Falk point out, international law presents clear and authoritative standards with respect to the use of force and recourse to war that should be followed by all states, and if under exceptional circumstances any departure is allowed, a heavy burden of persuasion is on the state claiming the exception. That should be the conventional understanding in a decent society. And so it appears to be among the general American population, though in sharp contrast, the idea receives little expression within elite opinion. Friel and Falk add to the ample documentation of that conclusion with a detailed analysis of the persistent refusal of the New York Times to consider international law arguments that oppose the recourse to war and the conduct of war by American political leaders for the 40 years they survey. The Times, they show, is vigorous in its denunciation of global adversaries of the United States who contemplate aggressive wars or engage in hostile acts against American citizens in violation of international law, but ignores such matters in the case of U.S. actions. As one illustration, they point out that the words UN Charter or international law never appeared in its 70 editorials leading up to the invasion of Iraq, and they find that absence to be virtually uniform in opinion columns and other articles. They select the Times only because of its unusual importance, but as many other studies show, it